Hello and welcome back to Infamous Indie. I'm your host, That Dead Girl, and if this is your first time joining me, basically what I do here is I sit down with you all and I share with you a true crime story from my home state of Indiana. And if you've been keeping tabs on everything Infamous Indie, then obviously you know we've been talking quite a bit about the Sylvia Likens case. And I think I've done 3 parts so far. So this video today will be the final part. So I just want to say congratulations to you if you've made it this far. I kind of feel like, we made it through this story together. I know it has been quite a bit to unpack. And the content has been very graphic. Definitely not a story for the lighthearted. But this week we will definitely be getting into the conclusion of our story. But before I do get down into the conclusion of our story, I did want to address something because a few of you have actually reached out to me in regards to the pronunciation of Gertrude's last name. So obviously I really do try to take care and, making sure that I pronounce words correctly and pronounce names right. Sometimes that's not as easy as it may sound, especially with a unique name like Gertrude. So throughout my research, I've definitely heard it pronounced several different ways. I've heard Baniszewski, Baniszewski, Baniszewski. Like, there's just several different ways I've heard her name pronounced. So basically, what I did is I typed her name into Google Translate and it said Baniszewski. So that is what I went with. You can say her name however you wish. Obviously, I strive for accuracy, but when it comes to Gertrude herself, she's kind of a piece of shit person. So honestly, I don't really care whether or not I'm pronouncing her name right. With that being said, let's just get right down into part 4 of our story, and this is the conclusion of the Sylvia Likens story. At the end of part 3, I believe we left off with Gertrude instructing Ricky and Stephanie to take Sylvia upstairs and give her a bath. And in the process of them giving her this bath, they quickly realized that Sylvia actually is not breathing. And I believe I had also mentioned that Stephanie Baniszewski had actually tried to perform CPR on Sylvia, but her attempts were unsuccessful because Sylvia was already dead. So once Stephanie and Ricky have realized that Sylvia is not breathing, they pull her out of the bathtub. Stephanie's performing CPR. She realizes it's not working, so she yells at Ricky and tells him to go downstairs and get her mother. It said that Gertrude entered the bathroom and immediately became very, very angry. Because in Gertrude's twisted little mind, she actually believes that Sylvia is alive. She's just faking it. She actually picks up a book and begins striking Sylvia's body with it several times in an attempt to wake her up. And as Gertrude's striking Sylvia's body with this book, she just keeps screaming at her, "Stop faking it. You're a faker. I know you're faking." And after a few moments of this sort of erratic behavior, it finally clicks inside Gertrude's head and she realizes that Sylvia Likens has passed away. And it's at this point that Gertrude kind of begins to panic. But because Gertrude is a sick and twisted individual, the wheels start turning in her mind and she quickly starts to formulate a plan. Gertrude then instructs Ricky Hobbs and her daughter Stephanie to remove Sylvia's wet clothing, dry her off, put her into dry clothing, and place her body on a mattress in a nearby bedroom. Gertrude then tells Ricky Hobbs to go to the nearest payphone and to call the police. Now you may be asking yourself why a payphone, and this is because Gertrude Baniszewski actually does not have a working telephone in her home during this time because she cannot afford it. So Ricky Hobbs goes to the payphone and he calls the police, and they would actually arrive at Gertrude's house around 6:30 p.m. on October 26, 1965. Gertrude then led the officers inside and up the stairs to the bedroom where Sylvia Likens lay on a soiled mattress on the floor. And I do believe we actually talked about this letter that Gertrude had forced Sylvia to write in part 3 of the story. But basically, this letter stated that Sylvia had run away with a group of teenage boys and that they were actually responsible for the branding on her stomach and all of her other injuries. The letter also said that Sylvia basically went out of her way to piss Gertrude off and was disrespectful to her home, a menace, etc. Which, as we all know by now, that's absolutely not true. That definitely wasn't the case. But anyway, Gertrude saved this letter that she dictated to Sylvia and forced her to write, and she actually ends up giving this letter to the police. And Gertrude went right along with everything that this letter was basically saying. She told the police about Sylvia running away, although she couldn't even give a description of this group of boys that Sylvia had supposedly run off with, nor did she know the amount of time that Sylvia had been gone. All Gertrude knew at this point is that Sylvia had returned to her home earlier in the afternoon completely naked and clutching the letter in one of her hands. So, as normal, there are a lot of people in Gertrude's house. You have all of her children and a few neighborhood children as well. So, needless to say, there's a lot of commotion going on inside of this house right now. And during all of this commotion, Paula, who is Gertrude's oldest daughter, she's doing her best to act pure and act pious and basically do everything in her power to corroborate her mother's story. She even goes as far as to walk around the house clutching a Bible in front of the police officers. She even looks down at Jenny Likens and says, "If you want to live with us now, that's okay. We will treat you like our own sister." And that to me is kind of a true testament as to how evil Paula Baniszewski really was. Just the lengths that she and Gertrude have already gone to try to protect themselves and just keep the truth from everyone. So initially, the police do question Jenny Likens, and I know you're probably wondering, did she immediately come out and tell them the truth? And the answer to that question is no, she did not. So at first, she basically just regurgitates a story to police officers that's been fed to her by Gertrude. And this story goes right along with the letter, right along with what Gertrude's saying, and right along with what Paula's been saying. Basically, that, Sylvia had run away with these boys and she's a prostitute and all of this crazy shit. But like I said, we know is not true. And every time I have to mention anything like that in reference to Sylvia Likens, it just makes my skin crawl. It's so infuriating. But do keep in mind that the house currently is absolutely insane. Like I said, there's several people in and out of the house. The police are there, and at some point, Jenny feels as though everyone's distracted enough, and she finally tries to get the attention of an officer. And when she does, she actually whispers in the officer's ear, "If you get me out of here, I will tell you everything." And what Jenny would go on to tell the police was pretty shocking, to say the least. And within just a few hours of the discovery of Sylvia's body, arrests were made. Police would arrest Gertrude Baniszewski, her oldest daughter Paula, her daughter Stephanie, her son John Jr., and later that same day, Coy Hubbard and Ricky Hobbs were also arrested. And obviously, all of them are charged with murder. A few of the other neighborhood kids were arrested as well. Judy Duke, Mike Monroe, and Randy Lepper. They were charged with injury to a person, but those charges would later go on to be dropped as long as the three agreed to testify on the state's behalf. Gertrude, her children, Ricky Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard are all held without bail pending their trials. And while these degenerates are sitting in their jail cells, an autopsy is actually performed on Sylvia Likens' body. And the autopsy would go on to reveal the horrifying truth of what was really going on in that house of horror on New York Street. The autopsy showed that Sylvia Likens had over 100 cigarette burns all over her body, as well as other various second and third degree burns on random parts of her body as well. And it's thought that those burns were actually caused by the ritualistic baths that Gertrude and the others would give her on a regular basis. The water was scalding hot. They didn't care. They would just force her into the water anyway. Sylvia had extensive bruising as well as severe muscle and nerve damage. The examiner also found that during Sylvia's death throes, she had actually chewed through either side of her lip, almost completely severing it from her face entirely. Sylvia's vaginal cavity was nearly swollen shut, and it was later determined that this had occurred and was probably related to the incident with the Coke bottle. But further examination concluded that Sylvia Likens' hymen was still intact, largely discrediting Gertrude and Paula's claims that, Sylvia was this promiscuous girl who exchanged sex for money. Sylvia's skin had receded. Her fingernails were broken backward. She had been burned. She had been branded. Her body had suffered a slew of internal injuries, and her head had been severely bludgeoned. Some of Sylvia's wounds were so deep that you could see all the way through to her bones. The official cause of death was later determined to be brain hemorrhaging, brain swelling, severe malnourishment, and shock, and that was likely due to the excessive skin damage that Sylvia had suffered through. So at this point, police already have all of the suspects in custody. Gertrude was being held in Marion County Jail, while Paula, Stephanie, Coy, and Ricky were being held in juvenile detention. In Gertrude's initial statement, she actually denied knowing about or having any involvement in what her children had been doing to Sylvia. She claimed that she had no control over her children and that she had no idea what was going on because she was so sick and heavily medicated. But somewhere down the line, Gertrude's story actually began to change. She actually confessed to having known that her children, not her, just the kids, had been emotionally and physically abusing Sylvia for quite some time now. She would later go on to basically throw her oldest daughter Paula and Coy Hubbard under the bus, stating that they were the two that were most responsible for everything that happened with Sylvia. She also stated that Paula was responsible for most of the emotional damage and that Coy Hubbard had given Sylvia most of the beatings that she endured. Gertrude really didn't admit to much of anything other than the fact that she had actually made Sylvia sleep in the basement on 3 separate occasions due to her bedwetting troubles, and she was very adamant that she had only spanked the Likens sisters on a few occasions when they misbehaved. Gertrude would go on to plead not guilty, and she would also attempt to put forth an insanity plea. The oldest daughter, Paula, who seemed to lack any remorse, she's actually smirking in her mugshot, she would go on to sign a statement admitting to several acts of abuse against Sylvia, including beating Sylvia with a belt buckle, pushing her down the stairs, and blacking both of her eyes. John Jr. would go on to admit to only spanking Sylvia a few times, but he would also go on to say that he would actually put out lit matches on Sylvia's body and that he had witnessed firsthand his mother putting lit cigarettes out on her as well. Ricky Hobbs went on to admit to beating Sylvia Likens on more than 10 occasions, and he actually accepted full responsibility for branding the phrase, "I am a prostitute and proud of it," on her abdomen. And now I do just want to take a little bit of time and give you a little bit of information or insight as to what went down at this trial, because honestly, it was a fucking circus. It's a hot ass mess. And one of the most interesting things about this trial is that Gertrude, Paula, John Jr., Ricky, and Coy Hubbard were all tried together. So they're all being tried together, and the death penalty is being sought for all parties involved. And in a crazy turn of events, Stephanie Baniszewski actually turned state evidence against her family and friends. And basically what that meant is they would take the murder charge off the table as long as Stephanie agreed to cooperate with the state and testify against her family. One of the first witnesses to testify was actually Deputy Coroner Charles Ellis. He would go on to paint a picture for the jury as to the extent of Sylvia's physical injuries. Jenny Likens would also take the stand over the course of 2 days, and basically her testimony is what put the nail in the coffin for all of these people. She witnessed almost every instance of abuse firsthand, and I'm sure it's probably one of the hardest things that she's ever had to do in her life, but she was very brave in the fact that she took the stand, like I said, for 2 days, and she told them absolutely everything that had gone on with her and Sylvia while they were left in Gertrude's care. Randy Lepper, Judy Duke, Mike Monroe, and several other neighborhood children also took the stand and gave their testimony as well. They even called the family's pastor, Roy Julian, to the stand, and if you remember, we actually talked a little bit about him in part 2. He actually admitted to knowing that Sylvia Likens was being abused, but he testified that he did not report this simply because he thought Sylvia was being punished for soliciting sex. Gertrude would take the stand in her own defense. She basically denied any and all responsibility for Sylvia's torture and death. She stuck to her claims that her children must have committed these acts within her home while she was napping or too sick to do anything about it. She described her home as being a madhouse and basically claimed that she was too ill and too heavily medicated to really realize the extent of the situation. And the craziest thing is, even though all of these people are being tried together, every single one of them at this point in the trial has taken the opportunity to try and throw one another under the bus. Even though, in my mind anyway, they are all equally responsible for everything that happened. Just kind of sheds a little bit of light on just how shitty they are. So the pure Paula, when it comes time for her to give her testimony is actually postponed so that she can go to the hospital and give birth. Now, if you'll remember, Gertrude and Paula both have actually been adamant up until the day she gave birth that Paula was absolutely not pregnant. There was absolutely no way this could even be possible. So basically, her testimony was postponed, like I said, and she went on to give birth, and she named this poor child Gertrude after her mother. And the child was placed in foster care immediately. Ricky Hobbs would go on to testify in his own defense, and he would go on to talk a lot about the branding incident. He would go on to tell the jury, and he was so adamant about it. He really just wanted them to know that his part in the branding was done very lightly. I mean, as if that even fucking mattered at this point. You branded another human being. There's really not a lot that you can fucking say to make people feel sorry for you or make people believe that you did it gently. He also told the jury one very important fact. He had told them that he actually hadn't even expected to see Sylvia Likens at the Baniszewski house on the 26th of October. Because if you remember correctly, just days prior, Gertrude had started coming up with a plan to actually dump Sylvia's body at a separate location. And this was before Sylvia had even died. When they asked Ricky Hobbs what he had done after Sylvia's death, he basically said that he just went home and watched TV. Young Marie Baniszewski would actually be called to the stand as well. At first, it seemed like she was going to go right along with everything that Gertrude had previously said, but at some point in her testimony, she actually begins to break down. She breaks down crying on the stand, basically telling the jury that she knew that her mother knew how bad Sylvia's condition was and that she refused to do anything about it. She also said that she witnessed all parties involved abusing or emotionally abusing Sylvia on more than one occasion. She also stated that she had most often seen her mother Gertrude and her older sister Paula committing these acts of abuse. On May 16th, Dr. Dwight Schuster would take the stand, and basically he was the doctor that they hired to analyze Gertrude Baniszewski in regards to her insanity plea. He took the stand and told the jury that Gertrude was very evasive and uncooperative, but he also went on to say that she was definitely sane and in control of her own actions. The trial of all 5 defendants lasted about 17 days, and on May 19th, 1966, after 8 hours of deliberation, the verdict was in. Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Paula Baniszewski was also convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Ricky Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Jr. were all convicted of manslaughter. They each received sentences of 2 to 21 years. And I know what you're thinking. They got their just desserts. That is a very fitting punishment for the crimes that they committed. But In 1970, Paula and Gertrude's convictions would actually go on to be reversed. They basically claimed that they were denied separate trials, and because of the extensive media coverage surrounding the case, that they were unable to receive a fair trial. The pair were retried in 1971, and this time Paula Baniszewski opted to plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter. She was sentenced to serve between 2 and 21 years. Gertrude was again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison again. And despite of twice unsuccessfully trying to escape from prison, Paula Baniszewski would actually go on to be released in December of 1972. Over the next 14 years, Gertrude remained in prison, and it's said that she was a model prisoner, and a lot of the women in the prison actually referred to her as Mom, which to me, obviously you're locked up with somebody, you know what the fuck they've done. That's just disgusting to me, and I will never understand that prison life mentality, thankfully. But yeah, I don't get how you could look up to somebody who did the things that Gertrude did. Gertrude was eventually granted parole in 1985 and would go on to change her name to Nadine Van Fossen. Following her release in 1985, Gertrude relocated to Iowa, and she described herself as a very devout Christian. She never accepted responsibility for the prolonged torment and death of Sylvia Likens. She basically just blamed her children and the medication that she had been given to treat her asthma. Gertrude would later go on to die from lung cancer on June 16, 1990. After Paula was granted parole in 1972, she took on a new identity. She would go on to work as an aide to a school counselor for more than 14 years at a school in Iowa. Having changed her name to Paula Pace, she was able to conceal her criminal history and the things that she had done in her past. She was subsequently fired in 2012 when the school actually found out her true identity. Paula went on to get married and have 2 children, and the daughter that she had given birth to while on trial was later adopted. The murder charges against Stephanie Baniszewski were obviously dropped when she turned state evidence against the other defendants. And although prosecutors did resubmit her case, the decision to prosecute her in a separate trial never materialized. Stephanie would later go on to become a school teacher. She would marry, she would have children, and she was last known to be residing in Florida. Shortly after their mother's arrest, Child Protective Services placed Shirley, Marie, and Dennis Jr. in the care of separate foster families. Marie and Shirley's last names were eventually changed to Blake when their father would go on to regain custody of them in the 1960s. Marie Baniszewski would later go on to pass away from natural causes in 2017, and she was just 62 years old. Dennis Wright was also adopted by a separate family. Obviously, they would go on to change his name, and I didn't really find too much about what happened to him after the fact, other than he passed away in 2012 at the age of 47. Ricky Hobbs, John Jr., and Coy Hubbard would all go on to only serve about 2 years in Indiana Reformatory. All 3 were granted parole on February 27, 1968. Ricky Hobbs would actually go on to die from lung cancer in 1972, just 4 years after his release. He was only 21 years old. And in the years between his release and his death, it's said that Ricky Hobbs' mental health was very unstable, and it's said that he had several mental breakdowns during this time. Following his release, Coy Hubbard actually refused to change his name, and he actually remained in Indiana. Throughout his life, Coy Hubbard was repeatedly imprisoned for several different criminal offenses. He was actually charged with the murder of 2 men in 1977, but was later acquitted. After the release of the movie An American Crime in 2007, Coy Hubbard was actually fired from his job. Coy Hubbard would go on to die from a heart attack that same year at the age of 56. John Jr. would later go on to become a lay minister, and he would actually release a statement saying that he felt as though he and the other defendants should have been sentenced with stricter punishment, and I gotta say, I definitely agree with that. John Jr. would go on to pass away from complications due to diabetes in 2005 at the age of 52. Jenny Likens would go on to marry a man named Leonard Wade, and the couple would have 2 children. It said that Jenny Likens was severely traumatized by everything that she had gone through while in the care of Gertrude Baniszewski. She remained dependent on anxiety medication for the remainder of her life. Jenny would go on to die of a heart attack in June of 2004. Betty and Lester Likens also passed away in 1998 and in 2013. They repeatedly stated that no blame should have ever been placed on them for leaving their children in Gertrude's care. It said that the two never truly recovered, and they went on to live a life full of guilt and regret. Diana Likens, who we talked a little bit about, she was the oldest sister. She was actually the one that tried to go to Gertrude's house to check on Sylvia and Jenny. But anyway, in 2015, she actually ended up going missing for about 2 weeks. She was found in serious condition, stranded in a vehicle in the desert somewhere in California. And when she was found, the male occupant that was in the car with her had actually been dead for a few days. And as far as I know, Diana Likens is still alive. But strangely enough, it seems as though every person responsible for what happened to Sylvia has suffered immensely. Some people even refer to this as the Likens curse, and honestly, if they did suffer for the rest of their lives, I feel like that's just punishment. The house on New York Street, where these atrocities took place, it remained vacant, obviously, for many, many years. Everybody knew what had happened at that house. Everybody, probably in Indianapolis, knew about that house and knew what had gone on there. And obviously, nobody wanted to live there. And for a time, there were brief discussions about turning the house and the property into a women and children shelter, but the money was never raised, so the project never happened. On April 23rd, 2009, the house was actually demolished, and all that's left standing there now is a parking lot for a nearby church. In June of 2001, a granite memorial was formally dedicated to Sylvia's legacy, and it's actually located in Willard Park, and you can still go there to see it to this day. Sylvia's death is also credited with the adoption of Indiana's mandatory reporter law. And if you're unfamiliar with what that means, basically, if you are a person in a position, say you're like a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, a pastor, basically, if you're an adult in the state of Indiana, if you see signs of abuse and you do not report it, you yourself can go to jail, you can be convicted. I mean, obviously, it's very sad that it took such a horrendous crime to make this happen in our state. But at the end of the day, I am glad that we do have something like this set in place so that when people do see these signs of abuse, they can report it and they are encouraged to. In 2016, the Sylvia Likens Child Advocacy Center was established. The center was formed to assist victims of child abuse and neglect. The center works in conjunction with the police and child protective services, and they offer a lot of legal services and a lot of mental health services for victims as well. There are a ton of books, movies, etc. about Sylvia's story out there, and if you want to know more and you're interested in hearing everything, because obviously I can't include every little detail, I definitely would implore you to go check some of that stuff out. Sylvia Likens suffered so much in her short life. She was a beautiful and resilient young woman whose opportunity to live was basically just snatched away from her by a group of truly evil individuals. If we can do anything for Sylvia Likens, I think that she would want us to use our voices to share her story. And I actually would like to end this video by sharing with you all the poem that is inscribed on the memorial that was dedicated to Sylvia in Willard Park. I see a light, hope. I feel a breeze, strength. I hear a song, relief. Let them through, for they are the welcome ones. And that, my friends, is the tragic story of Sylvia Likens. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, especially if you were brave enough to get through all 4 parts of this story. Obviously, I know how graphic it is, or it was, and you know, it's definitely not easy to talk about. I feel like I say that all the time. I mean, I talk about murders and, abuse and things of that nature quite often on my channel, but it's just something about this particular story that has always just grabbed me by the gut. I think it was mainly the fact that Sylvia was so young and there were so many people involved who could have put a stop to it, and they didn't for whatever reason. And to me, that's just the most heartbreaking thing about the entire situation. I've been definitely hard at work working on some new content for you guys. I'm actually going to have another video up this week. I'm going to be talking with you guys, giving you a little history lesson actually about a woman named Madge Oberholzer. So that will be interesting. It'll be a little different from some of the stories that I've done in the past, but it's definitely still true crime related. And I've also been hard at work on my piece about the disappearance of Lauren Spear. So definitely be on the lookout for those. And if you haven't already, please do not forget to like and subscribe. And as always, if you like what I do here at Infamous Indie, please do feel free to share my content with other people who love true crime as much as I do. And don't forget to stay spooky, keep it creepy, and watch your back out there because it's a crazy fucking world.